Good morning, guys. I'm working on something today that I've wanted to do for a while. Back in 2018, at the very beginning of the My Bigfoot story, I read to you guys my account of what had happened back at Brian's cabin back in 1994, which is the story that, was kind of my introduction to Bigfoot, even though at the time I didn't realize that's what it possibly could have been. And I've always wanted to update that for you guys because I read that report sitting around a campfire, swallowing mosquitoes at night. I had to do it a couple of times. The camera had fallen over. It was just a bad recording, but people liked it. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to get that report and read it to you guys again and actually have it illustrated and add a few things to it. There's some updates, about Brian and a couple other stories and things that I can add that you guys have never heard about that area up there. So it's going to be an interesting video, so stay tuned because there's things that I should tell you guys and update you on why we haven't gone back, okay? And we will cover that, and there is a story there. Brian, unfortunately, guys, has dementia, okay? So Brian no longer owns the camp. His son owns the camp. And unfortunately, my best friend was his stepson, Doug, who has now passed on. You guys have heard the stories of Doug. We also had unfortunate relationship-ending events there. And then Doug passed on. And his stepbrother now owns the camp. And I have asked a couple of times and have not been given permission to go back to the camp. So what's going to happen is I'm going to end up just going up there with my tent some night and camping out because I spent many, many years up there and Brian would have zero issue with me going up there and camping out. And we're going to do it. Maybe this upcoming summer, Grant and I'm going to convince somebody to go with me because I'm telling you guys I still can't do it alone. But I did find a problem as we get into this. I have my transcript from my original video that I read to you guys, which at that time, I just went and found my report, printed it out, and read it to you guys. I can no longer find the report online that I submitted. So if any of you guys can find that, Roland Fuller was the investigator who met with me, and I don't know if he was with Sasquatch Ontario, Canada Sasquatch. Was there a BFRO department that dealt with Canada only? I don't remember. This was a legitimate report, and I cannot find it online. So I've had to spend 4 hours going through my transcript, rewriting it and fixing it because YouTube does a terrible job. And now I'm going to spend another 4 hours getting ChatGPT to illustrate images for us. And then I'm going to add some stuff at the end of the video, which you guys have never heard before. So this is the retelling of my Bigfoot story for all the new folks. I find as well, guys, the more videos we put up on YouTube, they're harder to find, the old videos. Unless you type in specifically the name of the video, good luck finding it. Or if you click on my playlists, they're there, but not too many people I find with the phones and that, you guys have a hard time finding and using playlists. So here it is, the revamped 2023 edition of Gary's first encounter with Bigfoot. Hope you guys enjoy. Thanks for watching. My Bigfoot story. I want to preface this by saying that this happened when I was 18, so these events took place back in 1994, when I was at a friend's camp up in Temagami. We were moose hunting. Before we get into the moose hunt, let me just tell you that back in those times, there was no Sasquatch or Bigfoot. It wasn't a thing. At least for us, in the small town we grew up in, there was no culture of Bigfoot. We didn't know or talk about a hairy man in the woods. There was no oral tradition or talk of Patty or the Patterson film. I had certainly never seen that footage, and no one else had ever talked about it back in those days either. Bigfoot was not just something anyone ever talked about, it didn't exist. There was a show back in the day called The $6 Million Man. It was about this guy that had been implanted with bionic stuff, and he was really strong. And in one episode, I remember that he fought Bigfoot. But my brother and I didn't really know what it was that he was fighting. Simply that it was just cool he had fought this monster in the forest kind of thing. So that was, one of the only things that we had attributed to a monster in the woods. A weird creature,
but we didn't know it was Bigfoot. When this incident happened, and for many years after, I didn't associate this experience with Bigfoot. I tried to find out what animals this could have been, what could have made that sound. I listened to many animals and sounds online, but I never really found anything that I could say, yeah, that's it. I never associated the incident with Bigfoot at Brian's camp, not until 2010. One night I turned on the TV and the show Finding Bigfoot was on, and I was instantly enthralled. These people's stories sounded exactly like mine, what they had heard, what they had seen. It was then that every little thing kind of lined up with the stories that I had heard from Brian, who was the owner of the camp that I was staying at that night. There were things that had happened to him, strange things, unexplainable events, things that humans just couldn't do. He had even found evidence of this creature in the woods around his camp. We will talk about Brian's experiences and his tales of what he called the man. Rabbit Lake Temagami Sound Report. Screams heard by campers inside a cottage. Witnesses reported. Submitted July 18th, 2010. Type of report, sound. Date of incident, October 1994. Season was fall. Time of day was 10 o'clock p.m. Weather conditions were clear. Fall evening. However, there was a real strong windstorm that night. My friend Doug and his uncle had gone up the mountain. Probably a mile away, they had camped out in a tent. Brian and I were at the main camp. Duration of incident was 2 minutes. Incident took place on Rabbit Lake at Brian's camp. A lone cottage, setting in thick bush with swamp, a creek on the lake. Nearest town is Temagami. Nearest road, Rabbit Lake Road or Highway 11. You have to boat into Brian's camp. It's on the backside in its own little secluded bay. There are no other cabins around Brian's camp. It's a pretty secluded spot. I was 18 and had gone moose hunting with a friend and his uncle and his dad. My friend and his uncle were camped up in the bush in a tent. My buddies, dad, and I were staying at the actual camp on the lake. We had been moose hunting in this area for about a week. This night we ate dinner, played cards, and after 9 o'clock we hit the bunks. Brian was asleep across from me, gentle snoring, and I was just starting to fall asleep. Suddenly, this horrendous scream came from outside the camp. I remember describing it like a woman being stabbed to death. It started as a scream, but ended as a flat-pitched howl. There was one scream first that made me instantly sit bolt upright in bed. I called for Brian. He continued to snore. Within 30 seconds to a minute, the scream started again. It turned into a wail and ended up as a howl. This thing was moving as it made the noise and went from the left side of the camp to the right side of the camp. I actually got up and woke Brian physically. He had heard nothing. I did not sleep until hours later. The next day at breakfast, Brian chuckled and proceeded to tell me that whatever I had heard was nothing compared to what he and his hunting crew had heard years earlier. He then went on to describe the same sounds I had listened to the night before. Brian was a very experienced trapper and hunter and cannot explain what they heard that night. I am now 34 and have been a hunter outdoorsman for 30 plus years. I have never heard anything like this before or since. It has always lingered in my mind. This incident was investigated by Roland Fuller. He and I met, and this is Roland's report. I met Gary this morning over coffee. It was a very good interview. Just a little background on Gary. He was raised in a rural setting in a town called Redbridge, Ontario. This town is located just a few miles northeast of North Bay. Gary is very familiar with the northeastern Ontario bush. He has a university degree in environmental studies. Gary was very enthusiastic to talk to someone who would believe him about the noises he had heard. Over the years, he had encountered numerous disbelievers and negative responses, so he had become somewhat unoptimistic about anyone getting back to him. Once he relaxed with me, he began to talk so much, I had to slow him down and write the info he was giving. Gary was hunting from the camp on Rabbit Lake that is owned by Brian. There's nothing between the camp and the Ottawa River but wilderness. This is a secluded location and not used very often. Brian had purchased this spot years ago from a native person. Brian and Gary had just settled in for the night to sleep, and Brian was already asleep snoring. Gary was just drowsing when the first scream happened. This immediately brought Gary to a wide-awake state, and he had tried to awaken Brian, unsuccessfully. The second scream then occurred. Gary jumped out of his bunk and physically woke up Brian. Brian had not heard either scream. The first scream had come from the front side of the camp, and the second from the front north side of the camp. So either there were two individuals or one individual that moved. Brian and Gary stayed awake for a while, and Brian tried to calm Gary, and then he went back to sleep. Gary took a long time to get to sleep. Here, I would like to add something and mention that is not in the original report. I actually loaded my gun and left it leaning against the wall beside my bunk. This is how sure I was that something had just murdered a person out there in the woods and was going to at any moment break down the flimsy camp door and kill Brian and I in our sleep. I was absolutely sure that this was going to happen at any moment. Eventually, try as I might, I had to fall asleep. I had been hunting all day and had hiked miles. We were exhausted, and even though I was terrified, I eventually did fall back asleep. The next day, Gary and Brian looked around the outside, but they never really looked for tracks or any other signs other than what they were hunting for there were 2 other people in the hunt group, but they had stayed in a tent further up the trail, and they had heard nothing. Gary tried to explain the sounds to Brian, who at first claimed it was a screech owl. Later, Brian said that it was nothing compared to what had occurred previously over the years. Gary's stories, although secondhand, include sightings of what Brian called the outdoor guy. So again, I want to correct this, guys. That's not true. That's an inaccuracy in reporting. Brian always referred to the native person around the camp as the man. Brian had related stories to Gary of the man, including tracks found of bare, wide feet, which were found around a swamp, items thrown at the camp, a big log mysteriously moved across the creek, but too big for 1 or even 4 men to move. Brian described a feeling of being watched, and Gary had the same experience. Gary said that Brian felt that there was a native person, First Nations, that was living in the bush behind their camp somewhere, and he would occasionally see him or be followed by him from a distance or in the trees, but not clearly. Gary left the camp 3 days later. The incident has haunted him ever since, and he would not go back to the camp for 4 years afterwards. After the meeting, I had Gary listen to some of the Michigan Recording Project audio files, and he was happy that he had finally heard that screeching sound again and that he was not crazy. He identified the first clip from the MRP August 30th, 31, 2008 river crossing event as being closest to what he had heard. In it, there was a screech or a scream first and then whoops. He recognized the loud screeching at the beginning and said it sounded like what he had heard, but the howling portion of the Rabbit Lake screeching went on longer. He also mentioned that the human-like portion was there in the screech on the MRP recording and that he could finally identify again a similarity in what he had heard. He said that the sound he had heard was very loud. We talked about a site visit which will require a follow-up after the interview was over. I asked Gary if he could arrange to talk with Brian because I really wanted to interview him. Gary was reluctant, but later in the day he called Brian to get permission for me to call him and passed his contact information on. I called him and talked briefly with Brian. Gary was right about the way Brian sees these happenings. Brian sees these as normal, natural events, and maybe so. Brian said he has heard the screeches and seen human tracks not only at Rabbit Lake, but also at the camp he had in Magnetawan. That's the tracks he's talking about, not the screeching. He said that he has had nothing happen at the camp in a couple of years. We are going to get together later in summer, and he has also invited me to his camp on Rabbit Lake for a long look, although he says there is nothing to see. I will keep in touch with Brian and get a meeting set up. Conclusions and summary, I feel Gary's event report to be real, honest, and there is much more investigating to do here. I spent time searching the adjacent area in the south side of Rabbit Lake. There are several logging area bush trails. Though people live here, the bush is thick and ideal for any creature to live. There are many swamps and small lakes. There are moose, rabbits, ducks, grouse. And I will be returning to this area in 2013 for more investigating. And that was the end of Roland's report. Here, I would like to add more context outside of the report. These are some of the things Brian talked about with us kids up at the lake all those years ago. I will say that after many years, I did return to the camp and had a few more weekends with Brian and the boys fishing. And even upon my last visit, which I believe was 2017, Brian always insisted all of these things did happen at the camp and that the man was real. There were many incidents where Brian was out hunting or from the boat and he would see the man watching him from shore or watching him from across the swamp, always just a silhouette of a person, and he said that sometimes the man would be wearing a red coat or a reddish hunting jacket. Brian had many tales of the man, strange occurrences that had taken place at the camp over the years. The 4 of Brian's previous hunting party had gone up a small creek 10 or 12 feet wide in the canoe one morning, and when they came back down at night, there was a log so big that 4 of them couldn't move it. This log had been dragged across the narrowest part of the creek. There were no trees around. It was marshland for a quarter mile on each side of the creek, and they couldn't find any tracks in the grass. How did this thing get here? They could hardly move it. It took them 20 minutes for the four of them to get this thing out of the way. Brian was adamant that the man had placed the log across the creek to tell him and his hunting party they should not have gone that far into the swamp, and that he was not welcome up there. And this was a point of contention between Brian and I, as Brian always insisted the man was a native man. Brian was convinced that this was the old fellow he had bought the land off of, and that he had then retired to the woods to live off of the land as his ancestors had done. I argued both the age of this man with Brian and the fact that the four of them could not move this log. If they could not move it, how did a single man, native or not, move the log by himself? Brian had no answers. I believe that because some of the incidents happening at the camp were so strange, Brian's very rational thinking mind associated everything with this native because he could not comprehend any other scenario. He did not want to think about monsters in the woods, or, as we now know, Bigfoot. Brian had a canoe, an 18-foot canoe. I can't remember the make. He thought it was stolen from the camp, and not until many years after this happened did Brian find the canoe. He found it way up past the camp, north, up that creek, past the end of the lake, miles north of there, hanging in a giant pine tree. He said it was like 40 feet up and tied, with just the skeletal ribs of the canoe remaining. My question is not only who would do that, but who could do that? Things were being thrown at the camp when Brian was there. Brian has also found footprints in the mud. He said that they were small, smaller than a man, those of a woman or a child. I do remember Brian being confused though, because he then told me the measurements, and he said the tracks were 9 inches long and 5 inches wide at the heel. He remembered them being abnormally wide. I remember him musing as to who would bring their kids out to the swamp to play, miles away from anywhere. But Brian always rationally returned to his theory of the natives, and he thought that maybe there were more natives living in the bush than he had originally imagined. That's just the way he looked at it. The other incident that Brian told me about was the night that him and his brother-in-laws and a friend, Brian's previous hunting group, had also heard the screams. Brian told me about his own account the very next day at breakfast after I heard screaming and lay awake for hours. Brian told me it was again mid-October, but probably 15 years before my incident. Him and the boys were just cleaning up after supper and were getting the camp ready for night, gathering wood for the stove and doing dishes. All of a sudden, right from out front of the camp, they heard the loudest wailing scream as if a woman were being murdered. Yes, he used the same words I did, and I know why. I have never witnessed a woman being stabbed to death, but let me tell you guys, in my mind's eye, this poor woman was stabbed, beaten, and then had each arm ripped off one at a time. That is how terribly she was hurt. The wailing was powerful and high-pitched. Brian told me that him and the boys froze, and then within seconds, all four of them had gone for their guns. He told me they barricaded the door and stayed awake all night. So let me be clear. 4 grown men who knew the woods and who had spent years hunting, trapping, camping, and living in the woods were terrified. They had never heard anything like that before. I had and have not ever heard anything like it again to this day. There are 2 things left I need to add to this account about the woods and cabin up on Rabbit Lake. Firstly is the atmosphere. The feeling of the woods up there is different than most places I travel or hunt. There's a feeling of being watched up there in those swamps. When we used to go up there to that camp when we were kids, we would go pickerel fishing, and we would always go down the shore from the camp about 300 yards. There was a little creek that came out, which is the creek that we go up and hunt in the canoes. The pickerel would come in there in the evening to feed, so we would stand on shore and throw our lines out and catch nice pickerel. As kids, numerous times we stopped and looked at each other and said it felt like someone was there, watching us, just off behind that spruce, always just out of sight. Doug, my friend, who was Brian's stepson, had brothers, and a couple of times they were up at camp with us, and we thought they were playing tricks on us. But it wasn't them. They were in the camp with Brian, and we were down by the shore by ourselves. We would have sworn they were there following us. You know, we even yelled, "Who's there?" It was always a strong sixth sense, hair standing up on the back of your neck. It's a spooky place, and I didn't go back for many years after my incident. As an adult, it's still a freaky place to be alone. I don't like to go up there in the bush alone, and I'll go anywhere in the bush except there. The second thing I will tell you guys about is that just a few years ago, at the camp, we had a boys' weekend. The guys were drinking. My brother and I called it an early evening. We had only had a couple of beers each, and we went to bed about 1 o'clock. There were 4 guys still up downstairs. I was upstairs in a bunk looking out over the lake. There was a window right in front of where my bunk was, and I saw an orange light 10 or 12 inches around, slowly drifting across the lake. I couldn't explain what it was. It wasn't a lantern. It was moving steady. It wasn't blowing in the wind. It was very steadily moving at an even pace, 200 feet off the water. Up until that night, I had never witnessed that kind of thing ever before. I was not familiar with the term orb, but now, years later, that is what I would call it. It was very orange, and I told my brother what I was seeing. As I lay there on the bunk, at first I was just curious and mesmerized. I watched it drift by, and when it reached the edge of the shore at the edge of the water, it actually went up and over the hill on that side of the lake. I will tell you, it is very steep on that shoreline. It goes up hundreds of feet, starting immediately at the water's edge. Sadly, I didn't have time to grab my camcorder, and the idea of filming it never even entered my mind. I rolled onto my back, and my brother and I discussed what I had just saw. About 15 minutes later, I just happened to roll over and be looking out the window again when I saw a second orange orb drifting across the lake. This time my brother and I immediately jumped up and raced down the ladder, downstairs, and ran out onto the dock. And we actually got to the dock in time that my brother saw it too. We couldn't hear anything, but we did see 2 orange glowing orbs that night, and if you look up orange glowing orbs on YouTube, there are lots of videos that have exactly what we saw on the internet. This was just another strange incident up there, and I don't know what those things are, but that they are there and they are real. Since that night, we have seen a few different orbs in the night sky. The most notable one was witnessed by myself and 3 neighbors. We had just returned from golf and were having a beer on Tom's back deck. A blue orb came floating into sight over the tree line about 100 feet up, maybe a little more. It's hard to say exactly. It drifted towards Tom's house before making a big U-turn over my own property and house beside where we were standing. It then headed back south into the swamp and out of sight again. It made no noise at all, but the 4 of us did see it. Thank you all for listening to my accounts. I assure you everything mentioned in this video did happen, and this is a true and real account. Bigfooter Gary out.